to get going in 2 minutes, everybody. 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us, everyone. To start with, Premier Mo will have some opening brief comments, followed by a time for a moderated Q&A. I'll call on you to pose your question. We will use a one-question format, drawing from those in the room and on the line. If you're in the room, please use the microphone. And as well, please be mindful that our time is quite limited, so we will have a hard stop at 2:45, but we'll do our best in the time that we have. Premier Mo?
Well, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues from across Western Canada and the territories for attending our Western Premiers Conference here today. We have to my right Premier Carolyn Cochrane from the Northwest Territories. To my immediate right is Premier Heather Stephenson from Manitoba. To my left is Premier Kenny. We had Premier Horgan attend as well, as many of you interviewed him this morning. He had to catch a flight back to British Columbia, and we had the Premier of the Yukon, Sandy Silver, that joined us remotely throughout the day and is joining us remotely here today as well. So welcome to all of my my friends and my colleagues from across the western half of our nation. We had a good discussion today. Started with a discussion around healthcare in general across our respective jurisdictions and the need for the federal government to come to the table for a proper funding arrangement through our Canada Health Transfer, of which we discussed earlier this morning. We also had a very robust discussion with respect to strengthening our economic opportunity in the western areas of Canada and the resulting challenging labor market that we are seeing in our respective jurisdictions as we find our way through this global pandemic. And we also discussed the training opportunities that we are undertaking in our respective provinces and territories, immigration opportunities that we might foresee working with the federal government on, as well as the ability for each of us to continue to be inclusive as our economies expand, as the jobs in our communities expand, that we're ensuring that we are inclusive and including all people in our nation in the economic opportunities that lie before us. Very challenging time in our provinces and territories with respect to the supply chains, with the trade, both internal as well as international trade that we have, and we had a discussion about ensuring that Western Premier's voice is heard when it comes to conversations around rail service to our communities, both for export and import. Our voice is being heard when it comes to port infrastructure, port governance, ensuring that those services are available for not only those folks that live in a port area, but for all Canadians, and ensuring that Premier's voices are heard when it comes to opportunities to expand both our rail service as well as our port opportunities, most notably the Port of Churchill. And we had a good discussion about the Port of Churchill and what opportunities might lie there into the future. Food and energy security, paramount in the global conversation, a conversation that most certainly Western premiers feel they can be a part of in not only the global energy and food security need, but the North American or the continental energy and food security conversation. There are emerging opportunities in the way of hydrogen and corresponding carbon capture and storage, rare earth elements, and the ability to develop that mining industry in the western half of this nation and across the nation, quite frankly, and the need for processing capacity to ensure that Western Canada is part of a transition that is not a switch that is flicked, but is actually a transition that will take years and likely decades. Uranium is one of the fuels available specific to Saskatchewan, but the oil and gas industry, paramount in our discussion, as we have Alberta, the largest producer of oil and gas in Canada, and some of the technology that is being employed in our various jurisdictions, carbon capture and storage, enhanced oil recovery, thermal investments that are happening in our province of Saskatchewan, but some of the most significant investment that is happening in the way of hydrogen and CCS, some of the investment that's happening in the Fort McMurray area and across Alberta in an effort to ensure that the oil product and gas product that we are producing in Western Canada is some of the most sustainable product available in the world. And as we transition in this nation, on this continent, and as we transition across the world, we would ask the world to look at these products that are some of the most sustainable that you can access, and some that we still will need for an extended period of time. Related to that, we talked about the regulatory uncertainty that many of our mining, our energy industries are operating within, specifically to the fact of the Bill C-69, and to the fact that Alberta has challenged that bill, and been successful in that challenge in the Alberta Court of Appeal. And we talked, and I would quote out of the press release that premiers discussed the recent ruling by the Court of Alberta that found the Federal Impact Assessment Act to be an unconstitutional intrusion into provincial jurisdiction. We are, if there is any subsequent action or a pull to the Supreme Court, Saskatchewan will be intervening on that, and I know other provinces are looking at their specific situation as well. That regulatory uncertainty went even further in our discussion, and again I would point to the news release that we had where premiers agree that the federal government should not interfere in areas that are provincial or territorial, of provincial and territorial jurisdiction. This infringement of the federal government in these areas is limiting, or has the potential ultimately to limit our ability to really provide that food and energy security, not only to the world, but also to North Americans, as well as within that, ultimately Canadians. A good and robust discussion led by our territorial premiers on security and sovereignty, in particular the security and sovereignty of our Arctic areas of Canada. And very important and paramount discussion given what we see happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so most relevant, very relevant discussion for each of us here today, as not only northern leaders, but I think in fairness, all leaders and all Canadians across the nation, to ensure that we are paying attention to our sovereignty as a nation. Again, I would point to one of the last statements in the news release where we say the federal government is committed to securing priorities in this area through the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. Premiers do call on the federal government to identify new financial resources to support the sovereignty in Canada's north, and we would ask that there was a missing line item in the most recent federal budget with respect to financing this Arctic sovereignty and this military presence throughout the north. So all in all, today, again, I thank my colleagues for coming to Regina, Saskatchewan for our Western Premiers Conference, the first time we've been able to gather in a couple of years. We had a very constructive conversation with respect to the state of the Federation, with respect to our relationship with our federal government and how that relationship impacts Western Canada's ability to achieve the opportunities that lie before us, achieve the opportunities to really provide that food and energy security, not only for our respective area of the world, not only for our nation, but to provide that continental food and energy security and really contribute to global food and energy security that I think is very paramount given what we are seeing in the world today following 2 years of a global pandemic and right now in the midst of a significant invasion of Russia invading Ukraine. So with that, we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have here today.
Thank you, Premier Moe. And now we'll move to media. We'll start in the room here with Mickey DeJuric of the Canadian Press. If you could just move to the microphone.
Hey, thanks for taking my question. I just kind of wondered if there's any new objectives to address affordability. I spoke to a Ukrainian refugee a couple days ago, and she said it's difficult to make ends meet with the cost of living because it's much higher in Canada than in Ukraine. Obviously, she's the only one working. Her husband's back in the Ukraine fighting in the war. This is something that not only she is feeling, but many people across the Western provinces are feeling. So are there any new objectives to address this affordability issue?
So maybe each of us want to speak a little bit to our specific jurisdiction. We've spoken a number of times to this. We just passed our provincial budget this spring. We are seeing natural resource prices that are increasing and look to be levelizing at that level. Should that continue throughout a number of months as we find our way through the fiscal year, we most certainly will be looking at ways that we can return that to Saskatchewan people, and by that I mean all Saskatchewan people. In Saskatchewan, our surplus will be a natural resource-based surplus due to natural resource pricing. We all own that resource as Saskatchewan residents, and we'll look to ensuring that all folks in the province would benefit from anything that we might do with any surplus here in this province. With respect to a Ukrainian immigrant specifically, we do have some supports that are in place provincially, as well as working with the federal government on any potential federal supports, and I would encourage that individual to reach out to a provincial office or even a local MLA to source some of those specific supports. So we are most certainly, and even maybe expecting to have that conversation in the months ahead. But we are not going to make a decision in the first 45 days of our fiscal year on something that may not quite be annualized throughout the year. So in Saskatchewan, I think the residents, if we continue with the higher natural resource prices, which create challenges on the cost of living side, and we understand that. You could expect some direction on that at Q1 update, Q2 update, when we have a little bit more surety that those numbers are going to be there for a period of time. So if Jason, Heather, or Carolyn have anything to add in your jurisdictions?
Well, I'm glad that's the first question, because the most important issue on the minds of Canadians, Western Canadians and all Canadians, is inflation, the cost of living. And the biggest single factor driving up that cost of living right now is the cost of energy. It is a global crisis. We are living through a 35-year high of inflation in Canada. And we're fortunate our energy prices are lower, like 1/3 lower than they are in Europe right now. This is a crisis brought on primarily by two things. First of all, a lack of investment in oil and gas exploration and development, part of that fueled by anti-energy policies coming from Ottawa and other governments. Secondly, it comes from Putin's outrageous invasion of Ukraine, which has resulted in, quite rightly, an embargo on Russian oil exports, limiting global supply. So these two things together are a perfect storm, in addition to COVID-era supply chain challenges. But now, this is why I was in Washington last week, to make the point that Western Canada can be a huge part of the solution to the global challenge of energy poverty and unaffordable cost of living by developing more of our responsibly produced resources. Canadians in particular should not be hit so hard by high energy prices when we have the third largest oil and fourth largest natural gas reserves on Earth. But that requires government policy to support its responsible development and shipping it to consumers here and around the world to get prices down. That was the message I took to Washington to the U.S. Senate Energy Committee last week. It's a message I reiterate with Prime Minister Trudeau. It's a message we address in the communique as Western Premiers, partly by raising the Federal Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69, which was struck down 3 weeks ago by Alberta's appeal court in a 4-1 decision. We will not get the investment we need to increase energy supply and reduce energy prices unless and until the federal government says that they are willing to create regulatory certainty to support a future for Canada's largest industry, certainly Western Canada's largest industry, and that's our energy sector. So I'm pleased premiers have underscored that in today's communique.
I think just briefly, I may just touch on, you talked about Ukrainian refugees coming to Canada, and we were just, we welcomed these refugees as their home away from home in Winnipeg just last week, and I can tell you we have put together a very robust program for those individuals when they arrived at the airport. We had a welcoming reception center for them to go to, where they were able to get access to housing, to childcare, to all of the supports, to employment, to all of the supports that they need for they and their families, just to welcome them here for their stay in Canada. And so we felt that was very important, and we certainly welcomed all of those individuals to our country. What is happening back home with their relatives is absolutely horrific. This is an unnecessary war that has been imposed upon Ukrainians. We will continue to stand with Ukraine through these very, very difficult times, and just ensure that those individuals who are coming here for safe haven have the supports that they need while they're in our country and in our province.
And I think for the Northwest Territories, we are looking at the supports that we can provide to refugees as well. However, the Northwest Territories has always been, we're also looking at what's happening to the residents of the territories. I'll link it to a different area than energy, is the supply chain is causing huge impacts on our inflation, the cost of accommodations, housing, etc. Like I had said earlier, we're now looking at public housing units, a duplex. We just approved a $1.3 million to build a house, a duplex, public housing. No gold taps, no heated flooring. So we've always been, the Northwest Territories, not sure if Sandy would like to speak after, but Northwest Territories has always felt that we didn't have the basic necessities that people in the South take for granted. And now it's coming up to even more of a crisis. We also have issues with Arctic security, and if our prices become unreachable, then how do we make sure that we have Arctic sovereignty, that we make sure that there's people in the northern territories? So it's a huge concern for us, not only for refugees, but for all residents of the north.
To the degree the inflationary pressures are due to the increasing price of fuel, oil and gas that we are seeing, we do have the ability in Canada, and I would say across North America, to take action on this. We're not going to wish and hope these inflationary pressures away. You're not going to wish and hope the price of fuel to go down. What you need to do is you need to invest, and I would say in Western Canada, we have the opportunity to invest in and develop some of the most sustainable energy resources available on Earth. And then we have to have the corresponding effort and action in place to make those resources available, I would say first to other Canadians and to North Americans, so that we have that continental energy security, thereby affordable food security as well. But also make that resource, that sustainable resource, available to others around the world. And we aren't going to wish this away. We need the federal government to join with provincial governments to take action on this file, develop this resource, which is among the most sustainable you can access in the world, and let's make it available to North Americans.
And next, we're going to go to the phones. We have Zach Visera with Post Media.
Thanks so much. I'd like to ask about the Premier's request for an increase in the Canada Health Transfer. And if it's all right, I'd like to go back a little bit. Almost 2 decades ago, a former Saskatchewan Premier, Roy Romanow, published a report from a commission into the state of Canadian healthcare. And some key parts in that report, he was very clear that there needs to be a greater federal investment in healthcare, which is what you've argued. He also said that federal investment needs to come with transformative change to make the health system work more efficiently so we don't end up back in a situation where more money is just sort of constantly needed. Premier Horgan, you spoke this morning about a rejuvenation of the healthcare system. And I want to know, if premiers get the money they're asking for, how will you invest it in such a way that you won't have to ask for a whole bunch of more funding, let's say 2 decades down the road?
I would just say a couple of things. This is the part one of the discussion, is to have the increase from 22 to 35%, which is the amount when you take into account the tax points that were granted a number of years ago, of where all premiers agree that the federal portion of provincially delivered health care should be. And I think Premier Romanow would agree with that, going back to his report a number of years ago. Listen, there's a number of points of similarity, and each premier can speak to their jurisdiction, of where investment would go in quite likely expansion of some of the services that we're seeing. And this morning I referenced, mental health and all too often subsequent addictions. We are investing heavily in Saskatchewan in that area, and going to continue to invest into the foreseeable future, and I trust other areas are as well. We are seeing in some areas of Canada there is a priority on investment into restructuring the care or the actual facilities in the long-term care area. And then that may differ in various areas of the nation. We're looking, for example, in Saskatchewan, as we have a collective problem across Canada due to 2 years of addressing a global pandemic. We have an increased surgical wait time in Saskatchewan, and I think that's true across the nation. We're looking at addressing that through an RFP that's out right now for private surgeries to be delivered, again, within the public system. So we would have the one line of folks that are waiting for a surgery. When you get to the front of that, you may end up in a private surgery center or in a public hospital setting. And so we have an active RFP out right now for orthopedic surgeries, for example, to be delivered in the private environment to help us address some of that surgical backlog that we have here in Saskatchewan. Other provinces have looked at different other various ways to help them reduce their surgical backlog. So I put that out as an example, and I said this morning. There's really 2 points to the ask on the increase of the CHT. One is about ensuring the system we have is sustainable. Ensuring that we can continue to recruit healthcare professionals of all designations, offer the services that Canadians expect. 2 is yes, there might be some areas where we're going to likely expand those services in the years ahead, whether that be in mental health care and addictions, maybe in long-term care, wherever that may be. But some other premiers may have some more to add to that.
Scott, if I could jump in. Zach, I agree with the premise of your question. We need health reform in Canada. It is a different era than when the Romanow report came out in 2002. 20 years later, we are now well into the huge demographic change with the boomers moving into retirement and becoming more acute users of the healthcare system. And we're all inheriting the whirlwind from COVID, the surgical backlogs that it has created. So, but having said that, pre-COVID, Canada, our provinces were spending more than the vast majority of developed countries with universal insurance systems. But we weren't getting the bang for the buck, and that is now more true than ever. We saw this. The Canadian system, for all of its strengths, underperformed during the pressure of COVID. We all had to postpone collectively tens of thousands of surgeries because we ran out of critical care space in every province at various times. And so Canada is in the top portion of the OECD in terms of per capita health expenditures, and yet we are towards the bottom of the OECD in per capita availability of critical care beds. We are well behind in terms of diagnostic and surgical wait times and the number of healthcare professionals. So I would argue it's not a lack of funding, there are systemic issues, and we need to learn, for example, from the universally insured, publicly administered European systems that seem generally to get better bang for the buck. And certainly that's what we're doing in Alberta, in part through, like Saskatchewan, substantially increasing the number of surgical procedures that will be contracted out to private providers within universal insurance.
Just quickly, from Manitoba's standpoint, certainly this was a challenge prior to COVID hitting and the pandemic, the worldwide pandemic hitting Canada and certainly in our province as well. And the challenge from that has just been exacerbated. And so we're in a situation where it's so important that that funding gets directly into the bottom line funding, and it's not just one-offs here and there, whether it be for surgical and diagnostics, whether it be for seniors care, whether it be for mental health and addictions. The most important thing that we all agree on across the country as provinces and territories, we all have unique situations within our provinces, and so that's why it's so important that we have that direct line funding to the bottom line of our funding to ensure that that we can put it to where it's really needed. I know in Manitoba, surgical and diagnostic backlogs is one of the most important issues that we're facing right now, and we're going to have to find unique ways and innovative ways to deliver those services for Manitoba, and some of those things have been discussed here today within that single payer system, and I think that's certainly, those are the things that we're exploring in Manitoba to ensure that Manitobans and Canadians get the health care that they need when they need it, and that we can start to tackle and chip away at those surgical and diagnostic backlogs that I think we're all facing. But again, the most important thing is that baseline funding, so we can start to address these very, very unique issues that are happening in each of our provinces and territories.
Carolyn or Sandy?
I think basically all Canadians, we call ourselves a developed country. And so within a developed country, you think that you have access to certain basic commodities, and healthcare is one of them. So, I don't want to see a time when it comes to Canadians when we have to choose, make choices from jurisdictions and saying, do you deserve to have your surgery today, or do I have to make you push off? I know we had to do that through the pandemic, but the pandemic has turned into an endemic. So it's time to, within our jurisdiction, healthcare, it's always the poor cousin. It always it has a hard time staying within our budget. It just takes a large amount of our budget, and we can't only focus on healthcare. We have to focus on every area. Canadians expect that. So we can't do this alone. We need the federal government to support us so that Canadians have the standard of living that they've accustomed to, that they deserve.
We will go to Chris Varco with the Calgary Herald. Chris, are you there? Chris Varco with the Calgary Herald. Okay, we will go to Tom Vernon with Global News.
Guess the phone lines are broken in Alberta today or something.
Right?
People were partying too much last night in Edmonton.
Okay, next we will go to Ian Fraze with CBC Manitoba.
Yes, good afternoon. This is a question for Premier Stephenson. A few weeks ago, you were asked about the minimum wage, and you sort of defended the rate, saying that because of the labor shortage, you expected some businesses to raise the wages on their own. But you are now looking to amend the minimum wage legislation in the province. Do you now see value in boosting the minimum wage higher than it is now? And if you do, what's changed?
Things that I've always talked about is that we need to be competitive with other provinces across the country. And well, even though we have indexed our minimum wage to inflation, I think we have somewhat gotten behind where other provinces have gone. And so we want to ensure that that we are not falling behind there. So we are taking steps to do so. But of course, this is all about affordability as well, and we've taken other steps in our recent budget to ensure that life is much more affordable for Manitobans, and we'll continue to move along those lines. The shortage of labor is a very significant issue. We had many discussions about that around this table today, and some very innovative things that are going on in other provinces. I think we can learn from each other about how we can do this and how we can work interprovincially to ensure that there's that allowance for movement of labor, various regulatory issues that came up as well that I think can make it easier for the movement of labor, particularly as we look at our shortage of labor in Manitoba when it comes to specifically to the nursing shortage as well, which again is nothing that's unique to Manitoba. We had discussions about this at this table. We have at our COF table as well, where there is that shortage across the country. And I think we're all trying to find ways of how do we attract people to these jobs and ensuring that we can make sure that we are decreasing those barriers for people getting into those positions. And so immigration is obviously a big part of that. And as we attract people to Manitoba and to other provinces and territories in our country, we want to ensure that we break down those barriers for getting licensed, for licensure and other barriers that are out there. So those are the things that we had, I think, a very good discussion about today, and I think that we'll continue to have those discussions at our upcoming COF meeting as well.
We'll just circle back to check to see if either Chris Varco or Tom Vernon are there for a question.
Hi, it's Tom from Global News. Can you hear me?
Tom?
Hi, sorry about that. I've been going back in history on a lot of these Council of Federations and Western Premiers. This is not a new request, this additional funding for healthcare. I've covered a few of these where I seem to be doing the same story over and over again. Apart from this continued advocacy and asking, what steps are being taken to try and convince the federal government or present a better business case to the federal government to actually get this funding moving forward?
You're from Edmonton. First of all, congratulations on the big win last night. And secondly, I'll take that on. This is a very good point, and I've raised that many times with my fellow premiers that having been around the federal cabinet table, I know that provinces asking for health funding often just sounds like background noise. But this really is a unique situation. The last time there was a serious federal commitment to increasing health transfers was way back in 2004, which is nearly 2 decades ago. And as I mentioned, since then we've seen our population has hit that demographic time bomb, and we got a lot more older Canadians needing care, needing long-term care and acute care. And then there's the COVID crisis. And we do appreciate that the feds put out a few billion dollars over the course of COVID to help support some of our emergency needs. But boy, we are all backed up massively on our surgical wait times, and we already went into it with big surgical wait times across Canada. And as the years have gone on, the share of federal funding for our overall healthcare costs has continued to decline to just about its lowest level on record. And so, in the case of Alberta, Tom, we put out an extra $2 billion to the baseline budget for healthcare, on top of the billions of COVID contingency funding, and it just still doesn't appear to be enough to address these acute needs. So, I guess we would say, in my view, the top two issues for Canadians right now: cost of living and healthcare, particularly surgical wait times. These are national priorities, and we need to see the national government step up to the plate. Scott, since you've been, Sandy, Premier Silver referred to, I just wanted to maybe help set some context here. So the Council of the Federation, which is all 13 premiers, asked three of our colleagues, to lead a dialogue with the feds on this issue. And that's Premiers Moe, Horgan, and Fury from Newfoundland, from three different political traditions, three different parts of the country. And, well, Scott, it sounds like Ottawa's not even picking up the other end of the phone line.
No, and we communicated some of this morning, and I don't know, Sandy had used the word, saddened, and, we were discussing in our meeting, what is the appropriate term? Is it saddened? Is it maddened? Is it just simply frustrated with the fact that not only can we, as premiers, 13 premiers who have a unanimous ask across the nation, sit down with the Prime Minister to have a meeting to discuss the quantum of the increase, of which he has acknowledged is necessary, to discuss the quantum of the increase to the Canada Health Transfer, which he said he would discuss as we find our way through the global pandemic. We can't even not only set that meeting up, we are unable to actually set up a meeting to discuss the parameters of that meeting. And so we seem like, we can't set up a meeting to discuss the meeting that we'd like to have.
It's like Groundhog Day.
It's quite a situation. And so, that leads us to, I don't know if we're, frustrated, saddened, maddened, what the appropriate term is. Shocked, maybe, is the term that I might use. Listen, we know to the question, this has been raised before, an increase in the Canada Health Transfer. The last significant increase was about 2 decades ago in this nation. It is time for this discussion to happen. The Prime Minister has agreed with the premiers on that. It is time for a substantial increase to become part of that Canada Health Transfer, to ensure that some of the challenges that I think were highlighted over the course of the past 2 years, but were likely there and in some ways masked by additional investments by provincial and territorial levels of government. But some of those challenges need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed in a sustainable way. The funding, and we had some in Saskatoon with the Prime Minister in the province this week, $30 million into long-term care. Thank you. It's appreciated. It's not sustainable on ongoing long-term funding. The funding that we had in the Safe Restart Agreement, of which many of us were part of negotiating that across Canada, thank you. That was important funding to support Canadians, whether it be municipalities in our education sector and our healthcare sector at the time. But again, it's one-time funding. It's not ongoing sustainable funding, so that we can increase our capacity of surgeries, so that we can increase our capacity of diagnostics, so that we can increase the number of healthcare professionals that we have, whether it's nurses, physicians, lab techs, CCAs, whatever that might be, in our healthcare facilities. And so it is frustrating. We're at a frustrating point here in the nation. We have 13 premiers that are asking the federal government to increase the Canada Health Transfer to 35%. That is where we started, at half minus the tax points. It's a legitimate ask, and asking them to increase the funding by that level annually into the future, so that they can become a fair funding partner in what is provincially delivered healthcare services across this nation. We understand that this is a challenging conversation. That's why we're inviting the federal government, the Prime Minister, to sit at the table and have this conversation with the provinces and find our way forward on behalf of all Canadians that collectively we all represent.
And for our last question, we'll go to Jeremy Symes with the Leader Post.
in the communique, there was a mention of a pan-Canadian economic corridor. Can you just explain a little bit about what that looks like, and does it in any way address some of the affordability issues we're seeing right now?
Absolutely.
Thanks. The concept here is getting the federal and provincial governments to work together to clear out unnecessary regulatory hurdles to getting our products to market. So yes, first of all, this is not a short-term solution to the inflation and cost of living problem, but it is a necessary part of preventing multi-year high energy costs and ensuring the future of the Western Canadian economy. You know, here in Saskatchewan, you are increasing production on potash and minerals. Last couple of years have been record years for Western Canadian grain exports. We're at record levels of oil and gas exports. In Alberta, we're coming on stream with, in the next few years, huge hydrogen and petrochemical exports. And we simply don't have enough pipelines to get some of those products to market, both domestic and foreign. And nor do we have enough rail capacity or port capacity. So we spent a lot of time today and yesterday, the four members of the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, discussing the urgency of expanding critical infrastructure to get Western Canadian products to markets. Now that's just good for jobs, the economy, investment, diversification, but it's also good for the cost of living. Like I said, here we are in Western Canada sitting on the third largest oil reserves in the world, fourth largest gas reserves, and yet we're paying, I don't know what, well, many parts of Western, and BC over $2 a litre for gas. On the prairies about $1.75. We're a little cheaper because we eliminated our fuel tax, by the way, but, and so we can help address that by getting more supply. So that's all tied in together with the idea of energy and resource corridors. And one particular idea I find very exciting that we put into the communique is the potential of Hudson Bay as we see the Northwest Passage opening up for longer duration of marine traffic. I think we need to look north as another opportunity to export Western Canadian commodities. And looking forward to working with Premier Stephenson and her government on that possibility.
Yeah, maybe I'll just touch on that as well. I mean, a lot of what we talked about today, you know, food and energy security, we talked about the challenges, the inflationary pressures that are happening out there. We talked about supply chain challenges, and so this is really getting into what is the solution and what is the more innovative way moving forward, and how we can expand on those opportunities to move goods. And so I think obviously the Port of Churchill has been around for decades, and there could be an opportunity there for us, and we would be happy to help be part of you know, a national solution to what is a very, very significant issue. So I think what this does is it's a start of a very important discussion moving forward that we will continue to have, not just as Western provinces and territories, but I think all across the country. It's going to be one of those discussions that we're going to continue to have and continue to come up with innovative ways moving forward.
Sandy or Caroline, any comment on you know, northern transport or port infrastructure potential?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that the world is changing. Like Hayard said, you've been asking for healthcare for many decades, you're not getting no traction. Just because things are, you ask and you don't get support doesn't mean you stop asking. My background's in social work, and one thing I've learned is don't stop asking or people will suffer. With the Northwest Territories, so right throughout the world, we're seeing supply chain issues. We're hearing about food insecurity, and I think we all need to pay attention to that. We often think that it's underdeveloped countries that are going to suffer for that, and you're right. However, we have a lot to offer in Canada. So we have to make sure that we get those things to market, as said by my colleagues. Within the Northwest Territories, within the north, our seas are opening up. It brings more threats to other countries that aren't allies as much, that might be looking at the resources, the support, the things that we have to offer in the north. But it also opens up opportunities. The Northwest Passage, the Arctic Sea, are with the ice melting, and so I'm going to put a plug in for climate change as well. Things are changing. All of you need to pay pay attention to climate change. We're seeing the devastating impacts in the north hugely, but we're also starting to see them in the south with flooding, etc. So we all have a responsibility to make sure. But we have opportunities. I mean, climate change is something we all like to work on, but it has opened up, like I say, the sea. And so we need to look at the opportunities that offers us as well to be able to market what we produce in Canada. I do believe we need to we have an obligation to take care of all humans throughout the world. And one way we can do that is by emphasizing the products that we provide in Canada and making sure that they get to market.
Sandy?
Well, I'm done on that, but was that the last question?
I was just going to make a comment on this.
Okay,
That is
sure,
the last
sure.
question. If you want to have
No,
the last
after you,
word,
yeah.
that'd be fine. I'd just say, and I know most of the questions today have came from Oilers fans like myself. I have been watching the series very closely, mostly to watch Daryl Sutter's interviews after the games, and his comments when Milan Lucic had a charging penalty for running Smith, the goalie of the Edmonton Oilers. I think they went something like, they asked, what did you think of the charging call? He said, well, I think he let up. Can you imagine what that would look like if he didn't? Seriously? And I think that same analogy can apply to where we are in Canada here today. Can you imagine what our nation would look like if we were to remove some of the impediments to getting some of the most sustainable resources to other people in Canada, across North America, and around the world? Seriously? Can you imagine what Western Canada would look like if we had the ability, if these impediments were removed, to provide some of the most sustainable oil that's produced in the world to other Canadians and to North America? Can you imagine what this would do, the wealth from developing this sustainable resource would do for Western Canada and all Canadians existentially, by allowing that wealth to develop our rare earth elements industry here in the province, to develop and build on the investment that's happening in the hydrogen industry, to really fuel the world and where we're going tomorrow? Seriously, can you imagine what that would look like in this nation, what that would look like in Western Canada? Can you imagine what the role Western Canada can play in providing not only the food and fuel security for Canada, but for North America and our continent proper? And other people in the world aren't going to do this for us. We need to do it ourselves as North Americans. Can you imagine the role that Western Canada can play in providing food and fuel security to the rest of the world, to the European Union, and the situation that they're faced with right now, being dependent for a large portion of their energy coming from the country of Russia? And I would say if we don't take this conversation of food and energy security very seriously in this nation and in this continent in the days ahead, we are heading down the very same path that we've seen the European Union head down, and that should be problematic, and that should be top of mind for all of us in this nation. But Jason Kenney, last word to you.
No, well put, Scott, and thanks for raising, as Carolyn and others have done throughout our discussions, the critical issue of food security. We talk about the cost of living here, largely driven by energy inflation, which does knock up the food cost of food as well. But with the Russian and Ukrainian wheat exports getting frozen, plus high energy costs translated into high fertilizer costs, that means less access to fertilizer, lower yields, and that is going to mean starvation for many people around the world. These issues are very real. And quite frankly, the irresponsibility of European energy policy has been unmasked. Sadly, it's not just working people in Europe who are going to pay the price, unable to heat their homes, but poor people in developing countries who won't be able to buy food this year. So these things are connected. But I did want to just, on your hockey analogy there, reflect that we didn't include this in the communique, but we did have a vigorous, last night our working dinner was actually while we were watching the Battle of Alberta, and there was a vigorous debate over whether Blake Coleman actually kicked that puck into the net or not. But I'm pleased to say that the Western Premiers are all united now, that the Edmonton Oilers are Canada's team, and certainly Western Canada's team.
Absolutely.
Are we agreed on that?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
No comment.
Heather?
You know,
Heather?
every meeting starts with a sports analogy and ends with it with these guys. So anyway, I love every meeting that we have with them. It's such a joy.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to all of our premiers. Thank you to all of you for joining us. That concludes today's availability.